And back in '82, there had been contact made because there were a lot of Northern Ireland veterans who were suffering from mental health issues because the stress of walking through the streets through your own people, knowing that you may have to shoot somebody or maybe you make a mistake and kill an innocent civilian, which did happen, and far too often, but unfortunate because the people were armed. And those guys came back with terrible, terrible stress, and it really impacted on the families. But we knew that there were mental health problems, but we chose to do nothing about it because it was a case of stiff upper lip. I remember reading one high-placed, outspoken royal saying, these people do not suffer from mental health problems, they're just showing a lack of moral fibre. It's about as helpful as giving somebody a bottle of chips. You know, it's not going to help anybody when the attitude from the hierarchy ignores the problem of the people at the bottom. How is it that we notice everybody that seems to suffer always comes from the ranks and never from up above? Because there's a better system put in for up above than there is for below. And I'm not trying to say a them and us situation exists, but there is clearly a better mop-up system. But because the amount of people that do suffer, I suffered for 24 years. And I had to largely suffer in silence because the military chose to ignore that PTSD existed. It only was allowed to exist after 1987. 1982, all the veterans who suffered there, all the people who suffered in Northern Ireland, all the people who suffered in conflicts and policing actions before that were largely ignored. I've met people from the Second World War who were brutalised by the Japanese who, if it wasn't for combat stress, would have received no mental health help whatsoever. The big problem is that it's become a stigma for the guys. The guys wouldn't present before because there was nobody to present to. Then after '87, they wouldn't present because it was a stigma and it would ruin your career. But largely what's happened over the years is that people chose to bury it because it was expensive to deal with, because we were looking at lots of psychiatrists. Now, if it's going to come down just to sheer economics, the cost of putting somebody through huge, lengthy treatments through the NHS, which can take 3-4 months, costing thousands of pounds a month, just on what I've heard and what I know from friends of mine who've been through it, guys who did Northern Ireland, did the first Gulf, then came out and went into the UN to do bomb disposal for 8 or 9 years, saw lots of horrific things. And then he's been having treatment for 3 months, and they've got to give him continued treatment because they're not even scratching the surface of this chap. It's hugely costly. And at this moment in time, everybody's looking at cost. You know, the human cost is devastating. The family cost is crippling because the amount of people who are falling apart. And we've seen far, far too much violence because PTSD is not just one of these mental health problems where people just fall apart because they're falling apart. The drink, the drugs, the crime, the violence, the family breakdown, the cost of the country is far, far greater than people are even imagining. And they pass it off by saying, you don't know what you're talking about because I have no qualifications. Hang on, let me just tell you, I've had 30 years of qualifications. I've lived with it, I've seen it, I've been involved in it. And the fact of the matter is, for the cost of what Talking2minds costs is minuscule, is tiny. When you look at the actual effect, you're seeing live cases here of people who've been through it. I went on one change program, not for myself, but because I was patron. I went to witness, and there was one young man there that tried to commit suicide by a police officer. So he was shooting a shotgun in the streets, trying to get the police to shoot him. After 3 days, I've never seen a chap happier. And this was a man who was totally lost to himself, had nothing left in his mind that he could give to himself or to anybody else. He'd given up. And all of a sudden, after 3 days, there's a man walking around, can't do enough for everybody else. I saw another chap that hadn't stopped drinking for 23 years. He hadn't had a drink for 4 days on the course. And he'd been drinking every single day. His wife was there with him, and she could not believe the change in him. If we're just looking at that cost alone, just the cost of what it takes, what financially it costs to get people back on the straight and narrow, I can't see that there's any other argument.
And if I may, Sam, just to give you an update on that particular gentleman that was running around with a shotgun trying to get a police armed response team to take his life for him. He's saved up quite a considerable amount of money. He's been working as a bricklayer and plasterer. He's saved up a considerable amount of money. He's managed to buy himself a small boat. He's had it coded in order for it to be able to go to sea. He's currently on a yacht master development programme for motored craft. And he's just got a loan from the bank, having submitted his business plan to be able to run fishing trips from where he lives. So, and all of that is within a 4-month process. We've not only supported him during the initial change work, but as a result of the volunteers that we've got, where we can, and he's gone from someone that was at a very low ebb to now being someone that's generating his own income and looking to employ people.
I mean, you've clearly got some fantastic individual stories. Can I just ask, in terms of your therapies, where were these developed? They've been developed in the States, have they? You've referred to the States.
Well, the States have a great attitude because they have a greater and far more rounded approach to everything. Yeah. When Helen Mary Jones asked the question earlier on, one of the best things that can be done is to have a whole rounded approach, but do it collectively rather than do it as separate groups that have separate income streams. Because a great friend of mine who's working in this area as well, and he does a lot of things called mental health first aid, which we've all seen people have breakdowns in the workplace. He deals with all of that. But he went to the States on my advice, and the Americans took him. All he had to do was find his travel. They paid for everything else. And he came back knowing that there were at least 5 or 6 therapies that he could directly employ to help. And it's not to just use one thing or to think that there is one cure. There isn't. We try to find cures for problems. We think we've got one brush that will sweep or paint every textured wall. We can't do that. And, I hate to bring it down to sort of simple terms like that when we're talking about people's lives. Mm-hmm. But at the end of the day, that's the way we have to look at it. There are so many things that we can do. But we need to bring a collective thought process rather than this group, the psychiatric group. The psychiatrists, well, they're trying to protect their little world because they've trained for so long. And in some ways you can understand that. But they need to be working far more with people who are doing things that have, in many cases, having a greater success rate.
At the heart of what we do is sits neurolinguistic programming, something called spectrum therapy, which has been developed within the UK. Oh, right. And essentially, neurolinguistic programming has been around for 40 or 50 years, and what we've done over the last sort of 4 or 5 years is evolve it and the language that's used within it in order to work specifically with vulnerable communities. And so whilst I'm sure if you were to Google NLP, you'll see lots of places where I see some nods around the table where it isn't necessarily that great. But it's very much a do with process. It's very much a coaching process. It's very much an emotional coaching process, and it very much empowers the individual. Now, we're fortunate enough that because of the initial pilot program that Rob was on, and the dedicated and level of interest that's gone on, that we've managed to evolve what we do. And so whilst initially 40 years ago it came from the States, it's very much homegrown at the moment, and what we do is currently is quite bespoke to Talking2minds. The issues that we face is essentially, I suppose, we fit into the category of complementary or alternative therapists because it's a talking approach, and because of the various the various medical guidelines, then we sit outside of what appears to be the usual or the more traditional pipeline, which is some kind of counselling, maybe some kind then of psychotherapy with a psychologist, and then onto some kind of medication, probably with a psychiatrist. And that one-size-fits-all pipeline approach, as it did for these gentlemen, because it didn't get to the root cause of their issues and truly help, it kind of maintains a level of stability, but doesn't really deal with the issue. And sometimes that level of stability isn't necessarily great. And so, if you always do what you've always done, you'll always get what you've always got. And we sit outside that, I suppose, that traditional framework. We're quite happy for anybody to come and look at what we do. We're in the process now of trying to liaise with a medical ethics committee in order to establish what we do, and obviously we're also currently in negotiation with, or starting negotiation with NICE, whilst they'll never be able to approve us, but hopefully they can come and endorse what we do, and we can be regarded as more part of the of the medical mainstream. But in that one size fits all, as Simon's saying, is that bringing that collective mix together of different number of approaches, then there's a lot of things that you can produce evidence that works, but they sit outside currently the traditional medical model.
What I've got to say is,
Yes.
when does it stop being alternative when it works? We've had alternative comedy. It's either funny or it's not. It's either comedy or it's not. And if something works and it's actually changing people and making people better, then does it stop being alternative and become more mainstream? Or what do we have to do, is the big question that we're all asking ourselves, is to make sure that people see this as being a genuine cure. I mean, in some cases it cures, in other cases, especially with Neil, it's brought it right down to the point where it's really livable with, and in some cases it cures everybody, and we've got to find a time when it stops becoming classed as an alternative, because everybody looks at that and we all start thinking of the 60s and everybody looking like hippies, and it's not about that. It's about genuine cures.
And I think fundamentally, for us, the point in time where we become non-alternative and we become mainstream is when we receive some statutory funding for what we do, because then there's a level of endorsement. Whilst we may sit outside the traditional medical model, there's a level of endorsement and support around what we're doing is achieving things with people, and it is. And this morning we could have brought any one of, to a sort of 300-400 people who would have a very similar story.
I'm very conscious of the time. The clock is really against us, and we've got a number of questions here that we will be covering. I think your the issue of NICE is very interesting. Perhaps if you can move on to that, Margaret.
NICE and how that you couldn't be approved by NICE as such because you are alternative. Is that the reason? Is it about evidence base? Is it because you haven't built up that?
And it's a level of time. It's about an evidence base over a period of over the period of time. So it's not something that's going to happen for us overnight. The assessment tools that we're using those that are endorsed by the World Health Organization as their guidance for measuring trauma and mental health, and they're endorsed by NICE. So we have our first academic peer-reviewed paper produced in later this month, actually, and for that level of endorsement, it's just a continual process for us in order to be able to gather that level of information and to provide that level of statistics to them.
Certainly in terms of time, periods of time. We've got case studies now 5.5, 6 years. NICE would suggest that they want 15 years worth of empirical data.
That was my next question.
which is, it's just not feasible, really, is it? With the current levels of post-traumatic stress disorder out there.
Just a quick question about you've said in your evidence that you've treated civilians as well as members of the armed forces. To what extent do you think it's necessary to provide a specialist armed forces service rather than one for anybody suffering?
I think it's probably best if.
I personally think, my belief is, there's a lot of things that we do in the armed forces, and you'll see in the paper I gave, there's areas under the Official Secrets Act you can't say things. So therefore it needs to be specific to service personnel, and it needs to be specific to what they've seen and been active in, because I can tell you now, we've all had therapy through people that have never been in the services, and when you say to them, well, I did this, I did that, they'll look at you in shock and they go, oh, that's really bad. Oh, that's really, and you think, well, no, I know that is, I'm here. So no, don't say it to me, I really do know that. And that's the kind of interaction you get from people that haven't lived the same field we have. We've got a completely different ethos.
Certainly, we're not looking at the stories. The stories to us are relevant. They're just a route in to help somebody reframe their own thought process. So somebody who would go in there and start indulging in the story is actually doing the client no good whatsoever. So,
a lot of the treatments that I went through before, cognitive therapy, all the psychological analysis and everything else, whatever you like to give the fancy name,